April 1945. A Japanese destroyer leaves port with fuel for a one-way trip. Not because someone miscalculated, not because the Navy lost track of supplies, but because by that point, very few men on board believed there would be a return voyage. The ship is Suzutsuki. She is not a battleship, no massive guns, no aura of national legend. She is an escort, built for one job, to look up and to shoot at aircraft, and she is sailing at the exact moment naval war is no longer decided by big guns. It is decided by the sky. At the start of April 1945, American forces land on Okinawa. From that moment, the Japanese High Command understands what Okinawa really means. It is not just another island, it is a forward doorstep. If Okinawa falls, the Japanese homeland is exposed. Airfields come closer, bombers arrive more often. The distance that once protected Japan begins to vanish. By then, the Imperial Japanese Navy is no longer the force that struck Pearl Harbor. After the Philippines, after Leyte Gulf, after months of attrition from submarines and air attack, what remains is fragmented, short on fuel, short on pilots, short on options, and yet an order is issued. The battleship Yamato will sail. With her, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers, including Suzutsuki. The operation is named Ten-Go. On paper, the mission is simple. Reach Okinawa, run Yamato aground, turn her guns into a fixed coastal fortress. In reality, almost nobody expects that to happen, because fuel is issued for a one-way journey. That fact spreads faster than any official announcement. It moves through crews the way cold air moves through steel compartments, quietly and quickly. No speeches are necessary. Men understand what one-way fuel means. It means the plan is not built around coming home. It is built around being spent. Suzutsuki belongs to the Akizuki class. These destroyers are not designed as surface raiders. They are designed as anti-aircraft escorts. They carry dual-purpose guns meant to fire fast and elevate high. They are meant to throw a protective curtain around larger ships. They are meant to meet incoming aircraft with controlled, continuous fire. On paper, Suzutsuki is exactly what a battleship needs. But by 1945, paper strength means less than it used to. Because the problem is not one airplane, or 10. The problem is waves. By the final year of the war, U.S. carrier forces can launch hundreds of aircraft in coordinated strikes. Fighters go first. They sweep the sky. They hold altitude and control. Then come the dive bombers, high above, dropping into steep angles. Then the torpedo planes, low over the water, approaching from multiple bearings. It is layered pressure. It is designed to overload any defense. A destroyer can shoot down a few. A very good destroyer can shoot down more. But no destroyer can empty an entire sky. On April 6th, the Ten-Go force slips out from the inland sea. The weather is fair. The sea is calm. From a distance, the formation still looks impressive. A massive battleship at the center. Escorts around her like a moving shield. But they are steaming into an ocean that no longer belongs to them. American submarines patrol the approaches. American aircraft scout wide areas. And American intelligence has become extremely difficult to deceive. By this stage of the war, major Japanese movements rarely go unseen. The odds of Ten-Go remaining hidden are close to 0. On Suzutsuki, routines continue. Gunnery crews check mounts. Ammunition is moved and staged. Communications are tested. Damage control parties verify hoses, pumps, and compartments. There is a certain calm that discipline can create, even when men already know the direction of events. Because when aircraft appear, everything happens fast, not minutes, sometimes seconds. There is no time for argument, no time for debate. only time for procedure. 10 Go is not a strategy designed to win the war. It is, in many ways, a statement. A demonstration that the Imperial Navy still exists, that it can still send a capital ship to sea, that it can still act. But statements do not intercept dive bombers, and resolve does not bend a torpedo's track. Across the sea, American carrier groups are already moving. Their strength is not only in ships and planes, it is in a system, a reconnaissance network that finds targets, a flight deck system that launches strikes, a logistics machine that keeps the cycle going, fuel, ordnance, replacement aircraft, trained crews. It is not just a fleet offshore. It is industrial capacity operating on the water. Early on April 7th, radar contacts begin to appear. Not a single blip, not a small group, multiple groups, closing. At that moment, Suzutsuki loses the most valuable thing any ship can have at sea: choice. With full fuel, a commander can delay, he can detour, he can hide behind weather, he can try to reshape the timing. With one-way fuel, timing is no longer flexible. The ship cannot simply roam and wait for conditions to improve. It cannot spend hours outmaneuvering a shadow. It can only continue forward and prepare. Suzutsuki was built to fight aircraft, but she was not built to fight an entire carrier war by herself. On that April morning, the first distant specks in the sky are not the beginning of a battle in the old sense. They are the beginning of a process, a modern process, the kind of fight in which the surface ship does not set the tempo, it reacts to it. And as those specks multiply and separate into formation, the men on Suzutsuki do not need anyone to explain what comes next. They man their guns, they steady their hands, they wait for the moment when the sky stops being background and becomes the weapon. Suzutsuki was never meant to chase enemy cruisers across the horizon. She was built to look up. When the Akizuki-class destroyers were designed in the early years of the war, Japanese planners had already begun to understand a hard lesson. Surface gunnery was no longer the only threat. Aircraft were changing the geometry of naval combat. Distance was no longer measured in miles between battle lines. It was measured in flight time. The Akizuki class was Japan's answer to that shift. Longer hulls for stability, improved fire control, high-angle, dual-purpose guns capable of engaging both surface and aerial targets. These ships were intended to serve as dedicated anti-aircraft screens for capital ships. On paper, they were exactly what a battleship needed in the carrier age. Suzutsuki carried 8 100mm guns in 4 twin mounts. They could elevate quickly and sustain rapid fire. The destroyer's role was clear: create a defensive envelope around larger vessels, disrupt incoming aircraft, and force attacking pilots to break formation. That doctrine assumed something important: that the number of attackers would remain within manageable limits. By 1945, that assumption no longer held. American carrier forces did not send in a handful of planes to test defenses. They sent in coordinated waves, structured to saturate and confuse. Fighters secured air superiority. Dive bombers attacked from altitude. Torpedo planes came in low, often from multiple directions at once. Each layer forced defenders to split attention. Each layer consumed ammunition. Each layer pushed human reaction times to their limit. Suzutsuki's gunners could track 1 aircraft. They could adjust to 2. They could even handle several converging targets. But when the sky filled with overlapping attack vectors, fire control became a race against overload. It was not a question of courage. It was a question of bandwidth. By April 1945, the composition of Suzutsuki's crew had also changed. The long war had thinned the ranks of experienced sailors. Replacements were younger. Training time was shorter. Fuel shortages had limited realistic sea exercises. They knew the procedures. They understood the mechanics. But few had experienced a full-scale, late-war American carrier strike. That difference mattered, because anti-aircraft warfare was not only about firing guns, it was about rhythm, spotting, tracking, calling corrections, adjusting lead, managing heat in the barrels, maintaining ammunition flow. A single breakdown in that chain, one damaged cable, one jammed hoist, one wounded rangefinder operator, could degrade the entire defensive pattern. And degradation in a layered air assault accumulated quickly. Within the Tengo formation, Suzutsuki held a screening position. As a destroyer, she had speed and maneuverability. She could swing out, alter course sharply, and reposition to counter incoming threats. In theory, that mobility made her harder to hit and more effective as a shield. In practice, constant maneuvering also made her visible. High-speed turns carved white arcs into the sea. Changes in bearing revealed intent. Aircraft circling above could identify which ships were actively engaging and which were slowing. As the formation pushed south, American reconnaissance continued to track its movement. The U.S. Navy's system did not rely on a single sighting. Submarines, patrol aircraft, and carrier scouts formed a layered detection network. Once Tengo was located, the response became procedural. Strike groups were assembled, aircraft were armed, pilots briefed. For the Americans, this was no longer an extraordinary event. Carrier warfare had matured into a repeatable cycle. Find, launch, strike, recover, rearm, launch again. For a destroyer like Suzutsuki, there would be no such cycle. Everything she carried had already been loaded in port. On the morning of April 7th, as radar contacts multiplied, battle stations were sounded aboard Suzutsuki. There were no dramatic addresses, no recorded declarations. Men moved to assigned positions. Ammunition crews stood ready. Directors locked onto distant specs. At extreme range, aircraft were still little more than points against blue sky, but speed collapses distance quickly. What appears remote one moment becomes immediate the next. Suzutsuki's guns opened fire as targets entered range. White bursts bloomed above the formation. Tracers climbed. The air filled with concussion and vibration. Metal shook with each salvo. For a brief period, the defensive rhythm held. Gunners tracked dive bombers as they began their descent. Torpedo planes were engaged at low altitude. Some aircraft were hit. A few fell trailing smoke. But the formation of attackers did not thin in proportion to the defensive fire. Because behind the first wave, more aircraft were already inbound. Anti-aircraft combat imposed physical strain beyond the obvious. Gun barrels overheated, crew fatigue accumulated, smoke reduced visibility, noise degraded communication. Each gun crew depended on human loaders to sustain rate of fire. Each mount relied on intact electrical systems to maintain tracking accuracy. A near miss could sever wiring. A fragment could injure a key operator. The ship did not need to be sunk to be weakened. It only needed to be slowed. As American aircraft adjusted their attack patterns, destroyers like Suzutsuki became attractive secondary targets. Smaller ships were harder to hit cleanly, but once isolated, they were also less resilient to damage. A destroyer that lost speed became predictable. A destroyer that lost steering became exposed. A destroyer that drifted out of formation became easier to bracket. In those moments, design theory collided with combat reality. Suzutsuki had been built to protect larger ships from the sky, but no escort, however capable, could substitute for missing air cover of its own. And as the morning progressed, the distinction between escort and primary target began to blur. The sky was no longer something to defend against in manageable arcs. It was a field of pressure, tightening. Suzutsuki continued to fire, but the number of targets above her did not decrease. It increased. By late morning on April 7, 1945, the attack was no longer theoretical. It was continuous. The first American wave had already passed through the formation. The second was forming. A third was en route. For the men aboard Suzutsuki, there was no clear beginning or end to the assault. There was only noise, concussion, and movement. Fighters circled high overhead, preventing any chance, however remote, of Japanese air support. Dive bombers rolled into their descent angles. Torpedo planes leveled off close to the surface, using the sea itself as partial cover. The destroyer's guns were already firing when the next wave arrived. At this stage, coordination mattered more than firepower. American pilots attacked from split bearings. Some approached the larger ships at the center. Others broke outward, targeting escorts along the perimeter. The purpose was not simply to strike. It was to fragment. A tight defensive screen works best when ships can concentrate fire. Fragmented ships must defend alone. Suzutsuki maneuvered aggressively. Her helm shifted hard over. Her bow cut white arcs into the water. Gunners adjusted constantly, tracking aircraft diving through layers of flak. From above, a destroyer in motion left a clear signature. The wake marked its path. The turns revealed its reactions. A ship that was firing heavily became visible in more ways than one. Pilots noticed. Around midday, the situation across the formation deteriorated rapidly. The cruiser, Yahagi, was struck repeatedly. Torpedoes slowed her. Bombs disrupted command and propulsion. She fell behind, then stopped. The battleship Yamato absorbed multiple hits of her own. Torpedoes began to list her to one side. Damage control teams fought flooding that increased with every strike. As the larger ships faltered, the geometry of the battlefield changed. The escorts were no longer shielding a cohesive core. They were becoming isolated points. Suzutsuki continued to fire. Her 100mm guns barked in rapid succession. Ammunition handlers fed rounds upward as quickly as human strength allowed. The mounts vibrated under sustained recoil. A few American aircraft were damaged, some were shot down, but the rhythm of the attack did not slow, because this was not a one-wave strike. It was a system at work. Aircraft that expended their ordnance peeled away and headed back toward their carriers. On deck, new bombs and torpedoes were already being staged. Refueling crews moved with practiced speed. Replacement pilots were available. The cycle did not depend on a single squadron. Suzutsuki, by contrast, carried a finite supply of ammunition and a single crew. There was no reload at sea beyond what she already had. At some point during the engagement, Suzutsuki was hit. Reports differ in detail, but the pattern is clear. Damage did not immediately cripple her. She retained some speed. She retained firepower. But in air warfare, damage accumulates like compound interest. A near miss can rupture plating. A bomb fragment can sever cables. A shock wave can disrupt alignment in fire control systems. Each impact narrows the margin for survival. As Yamato's situation worsened, attention among American pilots began to shift. The massive battleship remained the primary objective, but smaller ships were now easier to isolate. A destroyer that maneuvered independently became a discrete target. Suzutsuki's earlier mobility, her sharp turns and active gunnery may have prolonged her resistance. It may also have drawn attention. Dive bombers adjusted. Torpedo planes approached from new angles. When a destroyer loses formation support, it loses overlapping fields of fire. Defensive arcs shrink. Blind spots widen. By early afternoon, the larger Japanese ships were either sinking or mortally damaged. Suzutsuki was effectively alone. She kept firing. American after-action reports later noted that at least one Japanese destroyer continued to engage aggressively even as the formation collapsed. The anti-aircraft fire was described as persistent and disciplined. That description fits the role Suzutsuki was built to perform, but persistence does not reverse arithmetic. Each incoming aircraft forced a calculation. Engage high target, track low torpedo plane, adjust lead, reload, repeat. When attacks arrive faster than reload cycles, the math turns unforgiving. Eventually, another series of hits reduced Suzutsuki's ability to maneuver. Smoke rose from her superstructure. Speed fell. Steering became uncertain. A destroyer without speed becomes predictable. A predictable ship is easier to bracket with bombs and torpedoes. The final stage of the engagement did not resemble a duel. It resembled containment. Aircraft circled and descended in sequence. Explosions walked closer along the hull. Structural integrity weakened with each impact. At some point in the early afternoon, Suzutsuki could no longer maintain effective resistance. She sank after sustaining multiple strikes. There was no dramatic last broadside against a rival surface ship. No exchange of main battery fire across miles of ocean. Only aircraft overhead. By the time the sea closed over the remains of the Tengo force, the result was already clear. Yahagi had gone down. Yamato would soon explode in a massive detonation visible for miles. Most of the escorts were sunk or heavily damaged. For the United States Navy, the operation confirmed what had already been demonstrated repeatedly since 1943. Control of the sky meant control of the sea. For Suzutsuki and her crew, the engagement had been a test of endurance under a system designed to overwhelm. She had been built to defend against aircraft. On April 7, 1945, she faced an entire carrier war in motion. And no destroyer, however well designed, could outlast that for long. By late afternoon on April 7, 1945, the sea south of Kyushu was quiet again. Hours earlier, it had held one of the most powerful battleships ever built, a cruiser and a screen of destroyers moving in disciplined formation. Now there was no formation, only debris. Oil spread slowly across the surface. Wood splintered from decks drifted in clusters. Sections of metal floated briefly before slipping under. And in the water, men. Some clung to wreckage. Some held on to each other. Some simply tried to keep their heads above the surface. The sky, which only hours before had been filled with aircraft, was nearly empty. The violence had passed with remarkable efficiency. The battleship Yamato was gone. The cruiser Yahagi was gone. Most of the escorting destroyers had been sunk or disabled. Among them was Suzutsuki. For the United States Navy, the engagement had followed a pattern that had become familiar by 1945. Locate the target. Launch coordinated waves. Maintain pressure. Repeat as necessary. From the American perspective, Operation Tengo was a successful interception. It prevented a surface force from approaching Okinawa and eliminated one of Japan's last major capital ships. But from the perspective of the men who had been on those decks, the experience was not abstract. It was immediate. Survivors later described the sensation of sustained attack as something overwhelming rather than dramatic. There was no single decisive moment. There was accumulation, the steady concussion of near misses, the vibration of guns firing continuously, the sudden shift in balance when a nearby ship slowed or stopped. One former sailor recalled that the sky seemed organized. Aircraft circled in patterns. They descended in sequence. They did not appear chaotic. From the water, that order felt relentless. Another survivor later wrote that once the final wave departed, the silence felt unnatural. The noise had been so constant that its absence seemed unreal. The ocean does not remember battles, it absorbs them. Rescue operations began almost immediately, but they were limited. The remaining Japanese destroyers that could still maneuver were themselves damaged. They faced the risk of submarine attack. They faced the possibility of renewed airstrikes. Time in the water was measured in minutes for some. For others, it was longer. Cold exhaustion, oil contamination, and injuries took their toll. War at sea is unforgiving in that way. Survival often depends as much on proximity to rescue as on endurance. Hatsuzuki's crew, like those of the other ships, had little margin left. Operation Tengo did not delay the Okinawa campaign. American carrier groups resumed their operational cycles. Aircraft returned to deck. Ordnance crews rearmed planes. Fuel lines were reconnected. Replacement aircraft were available. Replacement pilots were available. The system continued. That continuity is important. A surface ship sails with what it carries. A carrier force sails with the ability to generate repeated strikes, detection, launch, attack, recover, rearm. Launch again. The rhythm does not stop when a single target sinks. That rhythm defined April 7th. Hatsuzuki was not defeated in a duel. She was consumed by a cycle. By the spring of 1945, the imbalance between the United States and Japan was no longer tactical. It was structural. American shipyards were producing carriers, destroyers, and support vessels at a pace unmatched in naval history. Aircraft production continued at levels Japan could not approach. Pilot training pipelines, though strained, still functioned. Japan, by contrast, faced shortages everywhere. Fuel was rationed. Training hours were reduced. Air cover was inconsistent. Even if Hatsuzuki and her sister ships had survived that day, there was no larger strategic reserve waiting behind them. Tengo represented the last attempt to use remaining surface strength in a decisive role. After April 7th, that option no longer existed. For decades, naval theorists had debated the decisive fleet engagement, massed battleships exchanging fire across miles of ocean, commanders maneuvering for position, heavy guns determining national fate. But in the waters south of Kyushu, no opposing battle line formed. No American battleship needed to close range. The outcome was determined by aircraft launched far beyond the horizon. The control of airspace dictated the control of sea space. That reality had been building since 1942. Tengo confirmed it beyond dispute. Hatsuzuki had been designed to defend against aircraft. Her guns worked. Her crew fought. She fulfilled her assigned role. But no escort, however well constructed, can substitute for missing air superiority. Courage does not increase ammunition supply. Discipline does not generate additional fighters overhead. By the end of the engagement, the destroyer was alone under a controlled sky. And that condition was decisive long before the final hit. When the sea finally settled that evening, there were no visible markers of where the formation had sailed. Only coordinates, only reports, only the memory carried by survivors. Operation Tengo is sometimes remembered for the destruction of a battleship. It is equally a marker of transition. It marked the effective end of large-scale Japanese surface operations. It marked the final chapter of a navy that had once projected power across half the Pacific. And it demonstrated with stark clarity that by 1945, any fleet that went to sea without control of the air was operating on borrowed time. Hatsuzuki did not return to port, but her fate was not determined by a lack of resolve. It was determined by imbalance, of fuel, of air cover, of production, and of tempo. The sea was still wide, the ships were still steel, but the sky belonged to someone else, and in the carrier age, that was enough.